All right, y'all. It's the top of the hour, bottom of the hour, however the time works. But it's time for us to get rolling here. My name is Mauri. I am putting this on as a discussion about planning for Denali and for Glacier travel more generally, because that's a topic that I've actually had quite a few folks that I've been teaching courses to recently really want to dive more into, is how they can plan better for Glacier travel before they actually leave their home, because a lot of us don't live like right in the mountains where we have easy access all the time to go into this kind of terrain. My background is I'm a certified mountain guide or ski guide through the AMGA, and I'm working through the rest of the international certification process. And before that, for the planning portion, served in the military as an officer in the infantry for over 12 years, doing like large scale operational planning. And I combine that guiding background with that operational background to bring you like what I'm going to be showing y'all today. And we have Megan on the line from Caltopo, because I'll be using Caltopo as the primary app. I've been using it since 2017 and love to use it. Megan, anything to throw in before I get rolling?
No, I'm just happy to be here and really excited to see what resources you're sharing. And if anyone has any questions about Caltopo or questions for Maury, please drop them in the chat, and we will make sure we get to all those, either answering them directly in the chat or I'll ask them to Maury later.
Awesome. Yeah, and so the questions, as they come up, please feel free to drop them in the chat, because I'll answer them when we get towards the end if they haven't been hit during the discussion. And there's some questions that may come up that might be better as a demo, and so I'll demo those sections as we get to them. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and there will be a quick presentation first, and then I'll roll into the Caltopo portion. All right, so here's a quick discussion on just mountain navigation in general and a few key concepts that build towards the total plan that I'm going to be demoing and showing you how I build as we go. First is no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and really like planning as we do it is a place to shift from. So we have to make fewer decisions while we're out in terrain. In the mountains, the enemy that we have is reality, and conditions and the reality of what's going on around us changes really rapidly. And like when we're talking Denali, it's going to be the weather forecast is going to change all the time. I did forecasting for a buddy who was on the mountain this past season remotely, and really it was a day by day to 12-hour by 12-hour forecast on what sort of windows he could work with, because it was a really challenging season up on the mountain weather-wise this past year. To first set ourselves up for success and build in bigger margins, one of the key acronyms that I use is PACE. PACE stands for Primary, Alternate, Contingency, and Emergency, and I apply it to every single critical system that I identify. For something like Denali, that's shelter, stoves, and then here I'll be talking navigation and communication as the examples. So for an example of primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, first, I have team internal communication, which voice is just us talking. If we're on a glacier travel section where we're roped up and maybe further spread apart and we can't talk to each other, that's where radios or an FRS radio with the channel put in can be really useful. Contingency would be hand and arm signals or some sort of non-verbal signal. So it could be like tugs on the rope, because if you're traveling on a glacier and somebody stops, then the rope will come tight and you'll know that that person has stopped, and then you can point or make your hand and arm signals. And then maybe our emergency for team internal communication could be time, as in, for example, like every 50 minutes we'll plan to take a break instead of just like having to talk about when we're going to take a break. For navigation, which is what the main topic of this discussion, first, the planning we do builds a mental map. And so that's my primary when I'm doing navigation, where it's like I've locked that mental map in by doing the planning and really helped it seat in my mind. Then we go into a digital map and compass. So this is where we have our navigation apps like Caltopo downloaded as an app on the phone with the maps themselves downloaded, and then an extra battery to make sure they continue working. The next, the contingency, the paper map and compass, is something that a lot of folks don't carry anymore, but it's something for a trip like a Denali. I strongly recommend bringing some sort of map because one, it's an awesome thing for a team to gather around to talk features that's bigger than a phone. And actually behind me, you can see the map that I printed off before the trip that I took up the mountain with us in 2023 on the last trip I took up to Denali. And then the compass, it can be like a small emergency compass or some way to find a direction. Just if your phone goes down, it's a nice thing to have to keep you on track, especially in a whiteout. From 11,000 feet down, every single day I was on the mountain, except on the way out, once we were past the 7,000 foot camp, was in a whiteout. So traveling in a whiteout is a reality on the mountain, and some folks call 11 camp sad camp because of how often it is socked in while you're moving. And then finally is planned handrails, and those are pieces of terrain that if everything else goes to crap, you can identify as you're moving through the terrain to keep you on track and hopefully out of some additional hazard. One piece just to get us all on the same language for as we talk through this is I'm going to go through a few notes on reading topographic maps and what we call the features and what they look like on a map, because this is something I've noticed a lot of folks don't have the easiest time with and can be a little challenging at times. So as we're looking at the map, we have our contour maps, and we'll have the contours on the map. Those are in a brown color. And then you can see the other colors that things are often annotated on the map with. For contour lines, we'll have our index lines and our intermediate lines that show pretty common. Index lines show elevation, and then intermediate lines show what's between those index lines that have the elevation marked. They will have a set spacing, which is typically 10 meters or 40 feet. That you can change, and I'll show you how to do that if it's needed. But in the mountains, going smaller than that, going down to like 3 meters or 10 feet is not really recommended because it just makes the contour lines almost muddy the problem. Contour lines are super valuable because they help us identify what type of terrain we're going to be working with, especially when 3D mapping is awesome, but it takes up a ton of data. And so you can often identify terrain features using contour lines without 3D mapping quite a bit quicker than using 3D mapping. So first on the left, we have a ridge and a ridge line. A ridge is a point of contours, and you can see it here where it points downhill. I know what is downhill because of where this water feature on the image is. Second is a ridge line. This is a series of hilltops or a series of high ground that extends over an extended period. The reason that these all say major is because that they are major in relation to the terrain around them. I will show a few minor terrain features as well as we go through this. Next is a hill, and that's just a closed circle within our contours. A saddle is a bit of high ground here that comes down to a low point and then returns to a high point, just as you can see in the image on the right, and you can think of a horse's saddle for creating that shape. Saddles are often passes or calls or things that we would pass through as we're traveling through mountainous terrain. Next, we have a valley, which is a major terrain feature. It's often going to have water down in the bottom of it. And we know it's a glacially carved valley if it's a little bit more U-shaped. And we know it's a river valley if it's more V-shaped. Next is a depression. And whenever you see these hash lines on a map, you don't see them that often, but whenever you see them, the hash lines point towards the low ground. Finally, the next two that are pretty important and really what I use to navigate with quite frequently are draws on the left here, which draws are small bits or minor bits of low ground compared to the terrain around them. And then spurs are minor bits of high ground compared to the terrain around them. And so in this image, it points to this bigger piece of terrain because it's small compared to this ridgeline that's on the skyline. And then you can also see little bits of high ground where I'm running the mouse now and little bits of low ground that run off the side of it. Those are even smaller draws and spurs. From here, I'm going to stop the share for a second and simply transition over to the Caltopo map to start talking through the planning process now that we've talked through that stuff. Oh, and I showed all of the things to start instead of blacking them out like I planned to. There we go. Alrighty. So here we have our image of the Denali zone. And as I zoom out, I can point out a few key features on here. So first we have Talkeetna. If we zoom way, way out, that we'll be able to see. And Talkeetna is where we all are flying in from for going into Denali. The only folks that wouldn't be flying in from Talkeetna are if they're, say, taking a sled or going on foot via the Muldrow Glacier from the north, which is actually the way that the mountain was initially climbed. And then we get to the airstrip. Here we go. Which is the Kahiltna Airport. And this airstrip is what we all fly into. It's about 15 miles from the summit of Denali itself. And the reason we're flying in there is because the aircraft and the mechanized means of access cannot go into the park. And that's really one of the closest park boundaries that they're able to land us at as we're approaching Denali. So when I'm looking at a mountain objective, what I am going to start with doing is identifying where my start point and where my end point are. To get to the end point, I have the summit of the mountain, which is up here at 20,300 feet. And as I said before, it's about a 15-mile movement with about 13,000 feet of elevation gain as you go. Before we even get into that or making our route, I'm now going to start toggling through a few different layers that'll help me do the planning as we go. So I'm going to zoom in here at the Kahiltna Base Camp area and just toggle some of those layers to show what changes as we work through the different options. One of the really common mapping options that I'll use is the topo layer. And for this layer, you can see that it starts to build in already some pretty common trails or features for the zone. And you can also see where that national park boundary is, where the aircraft aren't allowed to cross. And so they're able to just put in here because of an agreement with the park. Then you can also start to see, as we zoom in more, with this layer, we have some features starting to show, and those are crevasses, which is one of the main hazards that we'll be dealing with as we climb in a zone like Denali. One of the adjustments I love to make when I'm doing this planning is adding in what's called shaded relief, and I'm doing that here on the right. And as I tick up this shaded relief, I can set it so it completely overdoes the whole map when I go up to 100, or I can bring it down to in the 30s to 50s is where I like to set it. And then it really helps some of these features pop. And as I pop off slope angle shading, you'll even see how the mountains will become sharper or a little bit less sharp as we go. And so if you're not as comfortable as some folks with reading contour lines, adding in this terrain shading can really help with defining high and low ground. And then it can also help crevasses, when we're talking glacier travel and glacier navigation, pop really, really clearly. The next piece I like to add in is what was on the map originally, which is slope angle shading. And down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the colors or the key for the colors, where yellow is starting to get, or we're getting into 27 to 29 degrees. Then once we get into orange and red, we're looking at 30 to 45 degrees. And once we get into our purple, blue, and black is where we're getting even steeper. And once we get into blue and black, it's most often cliffed or serac terrain, a serac being an ice cliff that is formed at the terminus of a glacier. So this is where I like to have my info set up. And the day before you fly in, you have some additional things you can do to gather some information. So for example, I can throw up some weather stations. And as I zoom out, you'll see a purple dot down here at the bottom left and a blue dot up here at the top right. Those are the weather station. This one at the top right is the 14,000 foot weather station at the ranger camp that gets left on the mountain and continues to put out information. And so you can see here, like these are the conditions currently at 14,000 feet on the mountain. If I want to look at them historically, I can even pull up this chart and start to scan across. I'll do this for just knowing what I'm getting into, going into that terrain. These particular stations don't have any precipitation amounts. And so you won't be able to see snowfall in those zones using the weather stations. Now I'm going to get into just naming some features. And one of the first steps I take when I'm mapping after I've just gotten the map looking the way I want, which is how it is right now, is to start naming some features. And so in this region, I went ahead and built out a bunch of named features onto the map so we can all be talking about the same thing. And so you might have heard of Mount Hunter, which is just southeast of the airport. It's a 14,000 foot mountain and has a lot of hard climbing on it. As you come come out of the airport and down Heartbreak Hill here, you'll be looking across over at Mount Foraker or Sultana, which is an 18,000 foot mountain that is the next most climbed in the area after Denali. And when I say next most, you'll have about 1,200 people climbing on Denali itself during a given season, and Foraker will have maybe a dozen in most seasons. Then as we zoom out, we start to get some of the additional features going up Denali itself, and I will talk about each of those individual features as we move our way up the route. The next is we have the West Buttress itself. And so the red line that you can see here is the actual route for the West Buttress that I used and then edited. But the reason I pop this up is because now I'm going to show how I got to that route. And to show how I got to that route, I'm actually going to turn it off now and go back to and add in some zones. So when I am initially approaching a region, I will highlight some key zones. And so first, we have the Kahiltna Airport branch of the Kahiltna Glacier. We have the main Kahiltna Glacier. And I just highlight these so my team is on the same page when we're talking zones. And then we have the East Fork of the Kahiltna Glacier. This is sometimes used to approach the Cassin Ridge. We have the Northeast Fork of the Kahiltna Glacier, also known as the Valley of Death. It's the historic way that the Cassin Ridge was approached, and some parties will still use it, but it's not used as commonly anymore. And then we have the North Fork of the Kahiltna Glacier, which is also the West Buttress zone and where the majority of the West Buttress route goes. Once I've identified those key zones, named them, and highlighted sort of the travel boundaries, which is what I've done here. And to do that, I was using polygons. To make a polygon, I'll hit add polygon, and then it pops up here and I can name it, and then I can click where I want that polygon to go. And I can be pretty rough like I am right now, or I can be much more precise. And so that polygon will pop up here once I click on lines and polygons. And that polygon has not popped up because it is in a zone that I have not clicked right now, which I think will show up in a second. The next thing that I use polygons for is for identifying hazards. Yep, and there it is, because it went straight into my hazards bin, which is what I had used previously. So I'm going to delete that out. And now, I'm going to zoom in to just start showing how I did this, is the key I used is I created orange polygons to highlight where crevassed zones along this terrain go. And crevasses form in habitual areas. One, where there are turns in the glacier, like right here, just off the Kahiltna Glacier. You have where two glaciers come together. So this glacier and this glacier coming together, and we get crevasses where they start to come together. And then along the walls is another zone that is pretty commonly an area that crevasses form. Another is where terrain pinches in together. So we have these two glaciers coming together and the terrain pinches together. And that's where we get this, or we get that assist for this crevasse field forming. And then the next piece is whatever the underlying terrain looks like. And so if I zoom in right here, we'll see that these contour lines and then these contour lines get closer together. And wherever we go from less steep, like here where the contour lines are pretty far apart, to more steep is where we're going to see more crevassed terrain as well. And so the features here of the whole thing narrowing, two glaciers coming together, and the steep terrain going from less steep to more steep have combined to create a crevassed zone right here. However, when we're traveling on glaciers, we're often going to aim to stick to the meat of, or the center of that glacier, much like the nicest travel in a river is going to be moving down the center of that river. And so traveling in the center of a glacier is a great place to start. Now, since I have these layers identified and I move up where this route is, I can start to identify other areas of roughness because of the terrain shading that I have turned on. So here we have another crevassed zone. We have another one here where it's getting a little rough. Keep moving, and here we can see where this common trail crosses. And if I zoom in, you'll start to see some additional roughness show up here. And if I put on some imagery, then we'll also see some additional crevasses start to pop out. I also added this zone because I know that this is one area that a lot of people end up having crevasse falls on the glacier. Then as we go back to our topo layer, we'll continue moving, and you'll just see how these orange zones highlight areas not to travel. And so again, we have crevassed regions here. And could you travel, say, up this side instead of up where the ski hill is? Absolutely, if that's your choice. And we keep moving up the route, and we can see how these crevassed hazards push us into certain areas that are the normal travel area for the West Buttress route. Now, here's a new hazard that I haven't mentioned previously, and this one is an avalanche slope that habitually slides. And so I mark my overhead hazard with a red color just to differentiate it from the crevasse hazard where we're concerned about falling into the mountain. The only reason I marked this as overhead is because I know that this slope slides pretty habitually. And it's one of the things that the rangers will actually brief you about is that not to put your camp in the 11,000 foot camp too close to this slope because it has run into tents in the past. So you want to make sure you give this slope a pretty good berth, especially if there's increased avalanche hazard on that aspect of slope. Now we're going to continue working through this zone, the West Buttress zone, and we just have additional hazard areas annotated. This overhead hazard is probably the biggest overhead hazard that you pass under that causes issues for a lot of climbers. You'll see that there's more overhead on this slope here that the route will pass under, but it just doesn't as habitually drop as much stuff. That doesn't mean it doesn't drop anything, but this feature drops more on it, and this is where you definitely maybe want to wear a helmet, for example, and maybe give it a little bit wider berth than like even this line or the common trail gives it. Like give it another 100 meters or so extra space if it's a warm day, saying things are falling. Or don't travel under it because it's a pretty darn big slope. As we continue moving up, we have some additional hazard areas annotated, and as we get higher on the mountain, you'll start to see that some of the crevasse hazard starts to decrease. And I did not mark, but there is a pretty good hazard here on the Autobahn as well. So now that I start to zoom out on that whole zone, we can start to see where the route for the west buttress itself will run. And so these hazards, if we're going into an area that doesn't have a set route, is a great way to highlight where we actually want to travel. And so for the west buttress itself, the red line highlighting the west buttress route, and that I have marked. And if you hadn't created this already, you can go ahead and hit add line. And now I can start clicking where I want this line to run. If I want to remove sections, I can hit escape and it'll bounce those sections back to the last one that I created. And I will exit out of that. So now that I have these zones highlighted and this route highlighted, I can zoom in to make sure that, say, around this corner where I have a hazard that comes pretty close to the route, I can make sure that it runs where I want it to. And we might not know if it's running exactly where I want it to until you're in terrain. And one of the biggest mistakes I see folks make is when they put a line or a GPX route on their map or on their watch, they want to follow it exactly. And that's something you need to be able to make the decision to adjust once you're in terrain. And so one way I can sort of see in this zone if it is exactly the route I want to be following is some of the imagery. You'll even be able to see tracks from previous seasons running through. And here you can see where people have been traveling, and you can even see some parties coming around this corner right here on this imagery. And so you can check your route, one, on the West Buttress because so many people travel on it, simply by using imagery if it was taken at the right time. And this imagery is from summer 2026. And then I can do that all the way up the route. Once we get into this zone, you'll see that we have the 11,000 foot camp that it is often for many parties camp 2. One thing I'll highlight, actually before we dive into the 11,000 foot camp, I'm going to do the camps in order. So I'm going to zoom out and start adding in camps now that we have our route. So Denali, the camps are known where they are. And I'm going to add them in here in some of the optional camps that folks will use too for the West Buttress route. When we come into the Hilton Airport, we're starting at just over 7,000 feet. And then we drop down to Heartbreak Hill, and we actually lose 500 feet right out of the gate. And then from there, we move pretty darn flat across the Hilton and the Glacier, all the way up to Camp 1 or Advanced Base Camp. You'll often hear it called 7,000 foot camp. That is right at the confluence of the Northeast Fork and the North Fork of the Hilton and the Glacier. Now you'll remember that I said that there's a lot of crevasses where camps come together. And so this is, or where glaciers come together. And so this is one of the camps that you want to be aware of, that there are crevasses in this area. This imagery is not specifically showing that those crevasses, and there are a few other imagery tools I can use. Like, for example, I can use Sentinel Weekly for this zone, which right now, because we're in winter, it is not showing any significant crevasse terrain. But I can scroll all the way back to, let's go with the end of the summer. Let's go with August. And that might show some additional crevasse terrain. Let's go with another week. Yeah, so it looks like right now our weekly imagery is not. Yep. We don't have weekly imagery in this zone. Yep, there we go. Yeah, so there's no Sentinel weekly imagery in this zone. Okay, so the next one I can use is the Caltopo provided imagery. And I can turn off my shaded relief. And the resolution isn't quite as good here as it is on the Google provided imagery. And so I'm probably going to, if I'm using imagery, I'm going to stick to that Google provided imagery in this case. Or I'm going to go back to that hybrid map and make sure that my shaded relief is turned on to really help me identify those features. So now that I'm into Camp 1, and I was trying to show that in the summer you can see these crevasses because they open up a lot more, and you might have 2, 3, 4 meters of snow over some of the crevasses in this zone. But my point I was trying to get to is that in Camp 1, you have a lot of hazard that you might not be realizing in that camp, and so please probe that camp when you go to set up in it. Same applies with a lot or with all the camps on a glacier, but as we move up, we have the 9,000 foot camp here, and then the 10,000 foot camp up here before we get to the 11,000 camp 11K. And both of those camps, the 10K and the 9K camp, are ones that folks will cache at oftentimes, and you'll sometimes see folks stop at them, and it really depends on how your team moves and how your team's feeling if you're going to stop at one of those, the 10K or the 9K camp. I will say the 9K camp has a habit of being kind of windy, so if you have a ton of wind in the forecast, that's not really a recommended zone to stop at. Whereas the 7K camp or the 11 are much better when you have high wind in the forecast. As we continue up here, we'll get to where there's 11K camp, and if I turn our Google satellite imagery back on and I zoom in, you can see a little bit of a feature here, and I highlight this as a hazard because there have been crevasse falls in 11 camp towards the top of the camp. And so if you are in 11 camp, you'll often feel quite tired when you get into the camp, and you very much want to probe the zone that you're going to be setting up in before you choose to unrope or start digging. I had a close call where I actually fell in to my hip in a crevasse after we had dug out an area for our cook tent, and we had sawed out all the blocks. And the reason it happened is because we had gotten lazy and we decided not to probe camp when we were setting up in a storm after a long day of movement. And so luckily I only punched into my hip, but we were completely unroped in camp, and it was quite a large crevasse in this zone about where this shadow, which is likely a crevasse, is showing on the imagery. As we inspect the route and as you look at things, there may be the potential from 11 camp to avoid one slope that can be a hazard. And so as we come up out of 11 camp, right above it, you'll have Motorcycle Hill, and then you'll have Squirrel Hill. Squirrel Hill is a pretty off-camber slope, and it's where one of the fatalities last season occurred, where a gentleman ended up sliding off this cliff and then down onto the terrain below. And the whole time you're walking up it, especially if you have sleds, you're trying to get pulled to the north here off the hill because it's pretty off camber as you're traveling across it. And some years, this zone is not a problem whatsoever. The last time I was up on Denali, it was just complete white ice for the entire thing. And so you'll need to manage that hazard. However, if you have a firm sliding fall hazard here, and there is not a avalanche hazard, then this is an old historic route, and some of the ski parties will still take this route. The reason it's not as commonly used is it is more crevassed and it is an avalanche prone slope. And so that's an assessment that you could make based on the hazards that you're seeing for travel. As we come up Squirrel Hill and then across this open field, where you'll notice this route came quite a bit wider from this slope above us, we get to Windy Corner. Windy Corner is the next crux of the West Buttress route, where sometimes, actually one of my friends who went in around 2010, they had blue ice coming around this corner for the whole thing, and they actually placed ice screws as protection moving through this terrain. So it can be everything from soft, filled-in snow that has been well tracked out by parties ahead of you to being straight-up blue ice that is decently hard to protect and pretty easy to start sliding on. And so Windy Corner is one of those zones where you definitely want good conditions and good visibility if you haven't been up there before. As you move in here to the Broken Glacier, we'll often have some parties rather, will have a cache that they place, and they'll use that as getting familiar with Windy Corner from 11 camp as they're working on acclimation before they move all the way up to 14 camp. It's a choice that some parties will make to cache here at 13.5 instead of moving all the way to 14 camp for that cache. Later in the trip, it actually offers an opportunity for a rest day where you drop down from 14 camp to 13.5. So it's just under 1,000 feet of travel because 14 camp is at 14,200 feet. And then you can head back up to 14 camp for taking an easier, lighter day. Now, for most parties, or a lot of parties will overestimate how quickly they can get to 14 camp. 14 camp is like, we call it 11 camp sad camp. 14 camp is like where you want to get to because you just have this awesome amphitheater of terrain above you with a bunch of ski lines. It's sunny a lot of the time. Like when the clouds are sitting on 11,000 foot camp, you'll often have sun up at 14 camp. And so all those factors can lead to a lot of folks like really trying to push to get to 14 camp. There's a lot of not a lot. There are some parties who have tried to push to 14 camp in a day, and there's very few parties who actually have the fitness for that. Even Jack Kunzel, who set the fastest known time on Denali in 2023, when they went back up last year and that year, they said like trying to make it to 14K in one push with the sleds was the hardest day that they've ever had, and they ended up stopping at 11K on day one. Most parties will spend about a week getting up to 14,000 foot camp because they are not as well acclimated. Jack, in that example, he was living at 9,000 feet that season, and he was pre-acclimated using both altitude and a hypoxic tent. And so like he was able to try to push to 14 camp in that time. Most folks will take about a week to get to 14 camp. And one of the pieces of advice I got before I first went was to spend more time than you want to at 11,000 feet to help mitigate some of those altitude issues. And so we had planned for 3 on that trip and ended up getting stuck there for 6 days with the weather. And so while you want to push to 14, time at 11 is absolutely a value to have. As we keep moving, we have all these additional named features that move along the route above 14 camp. And because I want to leave time for questions and getting to them, I'm not going to talk through each of the named features. You'll see the yellow lines, which I broke out to annotate a bunch of the different ski lines that folks use. And then finally, once the route is complete, we've identified our hazards, we've picked our route, we've marked out our camps. I can click on the full route and I can first look at the profile, and that'll give me the entire line. So in this case, I have the line from the airstrip to the top. I will be sending out an email with this map afterwards, which it also breaks out by the normal legs, how people travel. So you can have a 14 camp, or excuse me, a 11 camp to 14 camp, a 14 camp to 17 camp listing of, or GPX route for the mountain to break out. This profile, we can see it breaks out to 15 and a half miles and then 13 to 14,000 feet of elevation gain over the entire route. So that's the whole route. But then we can break it out by days to get a little bit more specific. For this route itself, the next tool, and I use this tool all the time, is travel time. And you'll now see a bunch of different features have popped up. And so I named those features very deliberately, and I made sure they were placed on the route. And the reason I did this is because now, say from the start to Camp 1, I can scroll across and see that hiking or walking, this is going to take me 3 hours and 41 minutes. However, because I know I'm going to be carrying a sled, I'm going to make that a little bit longer. Let's go a 2 for our travel there for up and 4 for flat. Yeah, we'll work with that. And now we can see that our total travel time has gone up by about an hour. And so we have about 5 hours, and that's actually about what it took my team with the sleds to make it to Camp 1. And then from camp 1 to our 11 camp, so camp 2, that's 13 total hours of movement. And then we can subtract out the 5 hours from the day prior, or we can break these routes out into more deliberate sections. Now, you'll see that there are notes here on the right, and I'm going to make one additional adjustment, and then I'll stop this portion. So you'll notice that there were some notes in there. And so as you looked at the 7K camp, I said, beware of crevasse potential. And so I can click on that. I can hit edit, and you'll see notes here on the screen. And that's where I do that section. Now, say I got to the 9K camp and we're just going to take a break there. And so now I can put 30-minute lunch break. And one of the features I love about this whole travel time tool is that now because I put break in there, it'll add that time for me. So when I get to that 9K camp, I now have 30 minutes added for break, and it automatically accounts for that. And if I want to go back to my custom where I'd adjusted these numbers, that's 9 hours of travel with a sled to get to there from the Kahiltna airport. The way it's calculating that is what's called the Munter method, which is a feature of both the travel technique you are using and then in distance and elevation gain and loss. And it's a formula that creates these numbers. So I'll stop the presentation there and open up the questions for the folks that are in the chat.
We've got one from Bo. The info covered, what would change through the season?
Yeah, are you saying, so I'm going to assume that it's like during the Denali season itself. And the main thing that's going to change on this mountain in particular from mid-May through the end of July being like the meat of the season is the main thing that's going to change there is how covered or not the crevasses are. When I do my planning, I do a macro plan, and that's what this is. I'm looking big picture at the thing, and then I'm doing micro navigation when I'm out in terrain. And I can't plan for how much snow is or is not there. And so that change over the season is something that I am going to have to adjust for as I travel. For crevasse terrain, I'm going to be, for example, one thing I'm going to be looking for is areas where there are sags in the snow, where it's starting to dip a little bit from the smooth surface. And that's one thing that's going to indicate that there's a bridge that is starting to sag under the weight of the snow on it because it's starting to get thinner. And so that's one of the key things I'll pay attention to as I'm traveling, and then do micro adjustments to the actual GPX route. And let me know if that answered your question.
Great, thanks, Mauri. Mark had a question for the speed calculator. I believe he's talking about the Munter rate. Yep. Are you using that as an estimate during planning, or is it for en route?
Yeah, Mark, so I use the speed or the Munter unit calculator for travel time for initial planning. And then as I'm traveling through terrain, I'll actually note what time I actually got to those checkpoints so that I can adjust those numbers, those modifiers for up, down, and flat to how I travel. And so I know that with a sled that my modifier is 2 for the uphill because I've done that enough and I checked my travel rate. And so it's a good place to start to help us with the reality of what that movement's going to be, whether it's going to be a little faster, a little slower. And then I will make deliberate adjustments to those estimates over time. I'll also maybe adjust, like if there's a more technical section, like say going up the fixed lines above 14 camp, like maybe that's something that somebody's never done before, they're not comfortable with. And so I will adjust that section to be a little bit slower as well. The way I adjust sections to be slower is I will make it a separate section of the route, or even easier is I'll put in a note being like, hey, break 30 minutes, like this will take a little bit longer.
Yeah, I love that reverse engineering of your mentor rate, like comparing, your actual time versus estimated. That's a great way to kind of hone in on different types of travel. We've got a question from Zach. When you are planning for glacier travel, what sort of time do you allocate for transitions to and from non-glaciated terrain?
Yeah, that's going to be a 20 to 30-minute transition, depending on how efficient the team is. But I also try to build in just doing a break at the same time. And so that's one of the things I didn't mention within this route, that I will deliberately plan where our transition points are ideally going to be and hopefully tie breaks into those so we can be more efficient during the day. So that'll help make things more efficient, but I usually do 20 to 30 minutes. And what I'll do is like, hey, like we're going to do 20 minutes for food. And when we are done with this break, we are going to have the rope off and put away, or we're going to have the rope on. And same thing for if you're, say, skiing on Denali. Hey, we're going to start on skis going up Motorcycle Hill, for example. And then we're going to transition to crampons to come across Motorcycle Hill. Or, excuse me, across Squirrel Hill because it's firm. And so 20 minutes to 30 minutes is my normal time.
Great, thank you. We got another question from Bo. For odd snowpack years, conditions on Rainier can vary greatly and route planning changes accordingly. How true is that for Denali?
Yeah, it changes every year, and it's going to be different every year. Earlier season, you're going to have more, or not more, you're going to have different problems than you are later in the season. Later in the season, you're going to have a lot more crevasse problems. But if you get a big snowfall, then you're going to have a change in the avalanche hazard. If you have a bunch of wind and there's transportable snow, you're going to have a bunch of change. And so one zone that I'll highlight is the zone above the 11,000 foot camp, which I'll share my screen again quickly. Because 11 camp is one where like you have quite a bit of big terrain around you, and you have some big slopes above you. And so this is one where you want to pay attention to what the wind directions have been in the few days before you go out, for example, because if we're concerned about a wind slab avalanche problem, this slope looks really darn close to 11 camp. But if it was a south or a southeast wind, meaning it was coming from the bottom of the screen to the top or from the bottom right to the top left, then this slope would be scoured and this slope would be filled in. And so that's where we get this is a habitual repeater, because it has a big old fetch where this snow gets pulled from up here and then loaded onto this slope. And so just paying attention to those weather conditions in the weeks ahead of time leading up to your trip, especially the 72 to 96 hours ahead of the trip, is really helpful for helping identify those slopes of concern.
Great, thanks for explaining that. Sebastian's got a question. Curious if you could expand on the climatization on the mountain and where it matters most, 11K, 14K, or above 17K, and when to take that extra day. But he also would love to know, and then where do strong climbers get altitude wrong on Denali? So really kind of digging into the acclimatization and altitude there.
So Sebastian, one, I'll actually send out in the emails after this a Excel document. It has a few acclimation timetables. They're recommended, but they're not like the best or the best for your team, because each person acclimatizes a little bit differently. What I'll say is I'll start from the bottom of your question and work my way to the top. And what I'll say first is that where people often get it wrong is they try to go too fast. There was a fatality in 2023 where a climber from Colorado who has habitually gone up to the top of 14,000 foot mountains and lived at 6,000 feet tried moving to 14K in 3 days. And that may sound slow for folks who are used to doing a 14er in a day, but it's way different when you're sleeping at that elevation than when you're going tagging it for an hour and then coming down. That climber died because he ended up I forget if it was pulmonary edema or cerebral edema, but it built up over a series of days, and it was like 4 or 5 days into him being at 14,000 feet before he got put on oxygen by the Rangers, and then he ended up dying because there was a storm that came in, they couldn't evac him. And so first I'll say is like going too fast. And the recommendation I got from a buddy who has guided and summited Denali nearly a dozen times now was to spend more time at 11,000 feet minimum 3 days there for especially the first trip. And honestly, I was really like 2020 hindsight. I was happy that we got snowed in at 11,000 feet and spent 5 or 6 days at that elevation, because once we got to 14,000 feet, we didn't have issues with headaches and other altitude issues at 14,000 feet. And then really that helped us accelerate from there. Now, my party was not planning to stay at 17,000 feet. And so that same thing applies for a party that is going to be staying at 17,000 feet. Is you want to make sure you're feeling good at 14 before you move up to 17. If you're not sleeping at 17, you have a little bit more wiggle room because you're not going to be spending as much time at that higher elevation. However, very few teams should go from 14 to the summit in a push. Scott Johnson, the author of Training for the New Alpinism, recommends that you can do 1,000 meters in an hour at your home elevation before you consider, just like on a Stairmaster or in terrain, fitness-wise, before you consider going from 14K to the summit in a day. And that's just to make sure you have adequate fitness margins and speed for that day. Let's see. And I'm just going to make sure I answered that question fully. Yeah, and then taking an extra day, like if you're just not feeling good, like somebody might get sick. There was a party that was up on Denali, the last trip I was up there, where they were at 14K. One of the guys got a little bit sick in the party. And so they dropped back down to 11,000 feet for 4 days for him to get rid of that sickness. He had some sort of respiratory something going on, and just being lower elevation helped him. And then they moved back to 14,000 feet to continue their push. So like, be willing to change your plan and adjust to conditions. And like when I was last up there, moving out of 11,000 foot camp, it was a really windy and blowing day. And we stuck to our plan of like, hey, we're going to break down camp at day 3 and we're going to move up the mountain. We got 100 feet out of camp. We're like, hey, this is a really dumb idea. And so we actually went back to camp after moving 100 feet and put our camp back up in 11K. And we stayed there for another few days because of that storm. So like, go slower than you think you need to, especially if it's your first time or you haven't spent a ton of time like living at 14,000 feet and above.
Yeah, not many of us have spent time living at 14,000 feet and above. So that's some great advice there. Ander would like to know, have you ever had any issues with the Bergstrom under beneath?
Yeah. I personally did not have issues with the Bergstrand. That is the zone where you're gonna often walk across like the most open crevasses, because it's just that spot is just really broken up. And so if you want to be roped up coming off of Windy Corner and then under it to that broken glacier area. As far as the and if you're talking between Windy Corner and Squirrel Hill, I haven't had issues there because I often go wider around that steep terrain feature that I mentioned than most people do, just because of that overhead hazard. Like when you walk through there, it's like having bomb holes all over the place from World War II, because you'll just see these big blocks of ice and rock that have cratered in. And so you want to like give yourself some berth from that stuff because you don't want to get hit by that sort of stuff. I have not had issues with the Bergstrand coming under a Windy Corner though. We adjust our rope accordingly. One thing I didn't say, just talking glacier hazard, is the crevasses on the lower Kahiltna, like moving between the airport and 11 camp, are freaking massive. And so if you're used to traveling in, like say on Rainier, for example, where the crevasses are a little bit smaller, like you want to use for a 3-person rope team, you want to use that full 60-meter rope, and then make sure that you like maybe bring a separate rescue line to give yourself a 30-meter rescue line, so you have some extra rope to work with, or at least use the full length for those 3 people with that rescue line put on each end. Enough rescue line for a single line drop, not just because like you want 60, 70 feet between folks in a lot of cases on the lower Kahiltna, just because the crevasses are so big.
All right, we have 2 more questions.
Sweet.
If you're up for it. If anybody
totally
has any last minute ones, drop them in there. So Mark would love to know what map layers you download on the mobile app to bring with you on the mountain. So what do you value?
Yeah, it depends on the zone, because sometimes I'll download imagery and the topo because that's what builds the hybrid layer. For Denali itself, I only download the topo layer. And then if you wanted some additional information, like say you're operating recreationally in the lower 48, like cell phone signal, like the cell phone signal layer is pretty good. But for Denali itself, I only downloaded the topo layer, and I think you can download shaded relief. I just don't remember. Megan, maybe you can answer that if you know.
I do know. Yeah, if you download any map layer anywhere, you're going to get the elevation data with it. And so
Sweet.
that includes any layer that uses the elevation data, including the shaded relief and the slope angle shading. So as long as you download something, whether it's topo, imagery, what have you, you'll get those elevation tools offline as well.
Sweet. Thanks, Megan. But yeah,
Nope.
for Denali, it's the topo layer is the primary one that I download, and then I'll use that shaded relief to help me see things a little bit more clearly. If you make a map, a key thing with that, Mark, is if you make a map, you need to make sure you download or have updated all the features you added to the map before you go, because you need signal for it to update onto that shared map within a team, say. If you make any other updates, say when you're on the mountain, like for exactly where a cache is, for example, then you'll have to share that GPX by using AirDrop or Bluetooth with other members of your team. So make sure you also download the features in the map you've built instead of just the map layers. And then Sebastian, I see your question about, is crowding a consideration? I mean, should a team strategy change if climbing the busiest period? Main thing I'll say for that is, like, the West Buttress is going to be crowded from May through the end of July, like no matter what you do. The benefit of that is that you have a lot of people around if something goes wrong. The negative is that you might be dealing with crowding, especially in areas that choke, like Squirrel Hill, Windy Corner, and the fixed lines, where you just get some crowding. So one way you can mitigate some of that is time that you travel. Like, a lot of teams will move on the lower Kahiltna during the day, but if it's a warm day and you want to mitigate some of the crevasse hazard, then you can move at night. I've had some friends that have moved really successfully without having crevasse fall issues on the lower Kahiltna by going when it's colder and the mountain's a little bit more frozen, by, like, say, moving from 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. so that they're just not dealing with that crevasse hazard on the lower Kahiltna as much. The other piece is for if you're going to, say, move from 14 camp to 17, because you have first the fixed lines, and then you have the West Buttress itself, which is like the most exposed part of the route, because you're definitely making steps over a few thousand feet of exposure as you come across that ridge. The thing there is, if you leave a little bit earlier than other teams, like a lot of teams will wait until 10 a.m. to noon to make that move, just so it's warmer and they're not, like, cold in their tents while doing that move. And so that's one way. The other is, like, look at alternate routes. Huge issue I see folks have is, like, just following the GPX line and only being willing to do that. Whereas, like, you could, say, use Rescue Gully if you're comfortable doing steep snow climbing to travel up to 7K camp. Now, I'd say everybody should travel on the West Buttress proper, like above the fixed lines, at least once, because it's the most classic climbing on the route. But if there's a really crowded day, then be willing to shift over onto, like, say, climbing Rescue Gully instead, and have some of those alternate routes that you can travel on.
All right. That is everything from the chat. So
Awesome.
last
Yeah,
call, if anyone's got anything.
a last call for questions. And to wrap this, while we wait to see if any other questions come in, is y'all got an email with a trial code for Caltopo. If you want to use some more of the pro features, like that travel time feature, you need to have a pro account to do it. And so that 60-day trial code can get you that. I can't recommend using Caltopo enough. It's what I've been using for everything from guiding to military operations since and so I can't recommend it enough. One. Two is I'll be sending out within that email also a link to this map, so you guys can download those features as desired to use yourself, and then also a Excel document for acclimation, logistics, that is a checklist for gear. And so be looking for that in the next week once this recording is processed and I've done a little editing on it, so you guys can just, like, know that you have to make adjustments to it for your team. It is not like what you should do. It is just a resource for you to use to help make better decisions while you're out there. Thanks for listening, and have a good one.